In global finance, when the truth stops being theoretical, it starts becoming impossible to hide. Moments when the underlying system shifts so dramatically that even the people who aren't paying attention feel the pressure ripple through the entire market. And whether most investors realize it yet or not, that's where we are with XRP. Not because of price movement, not because of hype, but because the mechanics driving the next phase have already begun. And before December ends, the signs will be too large, too interconnected, and too visible for anyone to ignore. Before we go deeper, remember this video is for formational and educational purposes only. It is not financial advice. Always consult a licensed financial professional before making investment decisions. And at this moment, XRP is trading in the low $2 range. Now let's talk about what's actually happening beneath the surface. The real shift isn't a headline, it isn't a surprise announcement, it isn't a prediction or a date someone put on a calendar. The real shift is the convergence of structural forces inside the global liquidity system. Forces that have been building silently, steadily, and relentlessly. Forces that have nothing to do with sentiment and everything to do with the survival of a financial architecture that is reaching its limits. Tokenization is scaling too fast. Bond volatility is moving too violently. Gold liquidity is tightening too sharply, FX correlations are breaking too quickly, settlement windows are shrinking too severely, and OTC channels are thinning too consistently. One of these pressures would be notable, but all of them happening at the same time. That's a system screaming for evolution, and evolution doesn't happen gradually. It happens suddenly after months of quiet preparation. This is the phase we're in, and here's the part most people don't understand. When systems reach the point of structural saturation, the real shift moves from being invisible to unavoidable. Not because someone announces it, but because the markets themselves begin exposing what can no longer be concealed. Let's unpack this with clarity. For years, the development around XRP happened behind closed doors. Enterprise pilots, liquidity corridor modeling, institutional OTC accumulation, regulatory alignment, and settlement architecture built in silence, all invisible to retail, all critical to institutions. All part of a multi-year preparation phase. But every preparation phase has a threshold, a point where private development collides with public necessity, a point where the infrastructure can no longer remain hidden. That threshold is where we are right now. Look at tokenization. It's no longer a concept. Banks are issuing tokenized treasuries. Asset managers are launching tokenized funds. Sovereign entities are exploring tokenized commodities. These assets trade 24/7. Globally, without waiting for settlement windows, banking hours, or centralized clearinghouses. But the fiat settlement system behind them is still stuck in the past. This creates a mismatch so large that it can't stay hidden much longer. The system must either modernize or break. That's why institutions are preparing new liquidity rails. Rails XRP was engineered for. Now look at bond markets. The volatility we're seeing isn't normal. When yields move in large jumps, the amount of capital that must reposition is enormous. Traditional rails can't handle that speed. The risk exposure becomes too high. Settlement delays become too costly. Institutional desks are feeling that pressure every single week. And the more they feel it, the more the shift becomes unavoidable. The quiet phase ends when the pain of staying with the old system exceeds the cost of adopting the new one. Then there's OTC compression, one of the most important indicators of all. Institutions have absorbed XRP privately for years, keeping demand off the public chart. But OTC supply is tightening, block liquidity is thinning, sourcing windows are shrinking, and when OTC can't provide enough liquidity for institutional needs, the only remaining source is the open market. That's not speculation. That's structural progression. That's the moment when the hidden becomes visible. And that's why before December ends, not as a prediction, but as a systemic inevitability, the forces driving XRP's real shift will become too large for the market to ignore. Bond desks, FX desks, tokenization teams, liquidity architects, settlement executives, they're all feeling the same thing. The system is hitting its threshold. And when a system hits its threshold, its next phase reveals itself with or without permission. The shift isn't coming. It's already underway. And the only reason most people don't see it yet is because they're looking at the chart instead of the infrastructure. In the next section, we're going deeper into the exact mechanics of this shift, the invisible pressure points, and why the global settlement framework is approaching a moment where transparency becomes unavoidable. To understand why XRP's real shift will soon become impossible to hide, you have to examine the precise points of structural strain inside the global financial system, because the visibility of a shift never begins with price, it begins with pressure. And right now, the system is experiencing pressure across multiple layers simultaneously. Pressure that institutions cannot ignore, pressure that retail cannot yet see, pressure that inevitably forces what has been hidden in the back end to move into the open. Let's start with the force that is quietly rewriting liquidity dynamics worldwide, settlement compression. For decades, global markets operated on settlement windows, fixed periods where trades needed to clear to avoid unwanted exposure. These windows gave institutions breathing room. They gave liquidity desks time to reposition between market cycles. They gave banks predictable operational structure. But today, those windows are collapsing. Bond yields are moving faster than settlement rails can update. FX pairs are breaking correlations in hours, not weeks. Commodities are reacting to geopolitical shocks in real time. Tokenized assets are trading continuously without pause. When settlement windows shrink, institutions don't just feel inconvenience, they feel danger. Exposure increases. Reconciliation becomes unpredictable. Errors multiply, and the cost of maintaining outdated rails becomes higher than the cost of replacing them. This is the first driver of the real shift, a system-level problem that no amount of optimism or denial can suppress. Now let's look at the second force, liquidity fragmentation across global markets. In a stable environment, liquidity flows like a river, smooth, predictable, and interconnected. Today, it looks more like fractured streams. Asia begins the trading cycle with thin liquidity. Europe inherits instability and compounds it. The US opens into volatility and amplifies it. Overnight cycles fail to normalize any of it. This creates mismatches across every settlement layer, and mismatches force modernization. Why? Because fragmented liquidity increases, slippage, failed settlements, collateral requirements, risk premiums, and interbank tension. No institution can operate in that environment forever. They need neutral global instantaneous settlement. They need what XRP was engineered to deliver. This is another structural pressure that cannot stay hidden. The longer liquidity fractures persist, the faster institutions pivot towards settlement tools that unify markets instead of dividing them. Now, let's talk about the third force, the one that accelerates every other signal. Tokenization, scale, mismatch. Tokenization is exploding at a speed the market is not prepared for. Tokenized treasuries, tokenized funds, tokenized commodities, tokenized credit products, tokenized money market instruments. All of these trade continuously. None of them accept settlement delays. And the more they grow, the more they expose one truth. The world cannot support 247 assets on 9-to-5 rails. The gap is widening. Institutions see it. Banks feel it. Settlement desks track it. And every month, the mismatch becomes more obvious. This is why the real shift will be impossible to hide. The rails behind tokenization must evolve. And XRP is designed for the evolution those rails require. Now factor in the fourth force, OTC liquidity compression. This is where the quiet phase ends. OTC liquidity has served as the private runway for institutions to accumulate XRP without alerting the public. It kept market impact low. It kept volatility contained. It kept demand invisible. But OTC supply does not last forever. Block liquidity is tightening. Sourcing windows are shrinking. Negotiated settlements are becoming less flexible. Large orders require longer lead times. This is a countdown. When institutions can no longer accumulate privately, their demand is forced onto public markets. And when that happens, the hidden becomes visible. You cannot hide institutional demand once it enters the same liquidity pool retail uses. That is why this shift cannot stay hidden before December ends. Not because of a date on a calendar, but because the structural constraints that kept this phase quiet are eroding. And then comes the fifth force, regulatory synchronization. Regulatory bodies across multiple regions are aligning real-world asset frameworks, digital settlement guidelines, liquidity compliance standards, tokenization recognition, market structure reforms, cross-border regulatory agreements. This kind of alignment does not happen randomly. It happens during preparation for structural transition. And XRP sits directly in the center of cross-border real-time interoperable value movement. Not by hype, by architecture. Add all of these forces together, collapsing settlement windows, fragmented liquidity, tokenization, stress, OTC compression, regulatory alignment, and what you get is an environment where the back-end development of the last several years cannot remain hidden. The system is reaching its visibility threshold. When infrastructure can no longer support demand, visibility becomes unavoidable. In the final section, we bring this full circle. Why institutions understand this long before retail, what happens when hidden architecture becomes public reality, and why this shift is not optional but inevitable. When you step back from the noise and look at the deeper currents shaping global finance, you begin to understand why some phases remain hidden and why others suddenly become impossible to ignore. Every market transition begins quietly inside spreadsheets, liquidity models, regulatory drafts, and settlement backends that the public never sees. But every transition eventually reaches a point where the quiet work becomes visible, simply because the system has no other choice. That's where we are with XRP right now. Not because the price is exploding, not because of hype on social media, not because of speculative predictions, but because the forces underneath the system are converging so powerfully that the next phase can't stay silent much longer. Institutional desks already feel the strain. Tokenized markets already demand faster rails. Liquidity windows already compress daily. OTC supply already tightens. Regulators already align frameworks that once conflicted. When all these signals point in the same direction, the shift stops being optional. It becomes structural. And structural shifts don't ask for permission. They reveal themselves slowly at first, then suddenly. That is the moment we're approaching. Before December ends, the truth won't come from influencers, analysts, or predictions. It will come from the system itself. Because the cracks in the old rails are widening, the demands of new market infrastructure are accelerating, and the settlement architecture that institutions rely on is being forced into evolution. And if you're still watching this video right now, then you're not reacting to the surface. You're paying attention to the foundation. You're thinking like an architect, not a gambler. You understand that real change begins long before the world notices it, and that preparation beats prediction every single time. So, if you found clarity here today, do me one favor. Tap like, hit subscribe, and comment the word visible so I know you're one of the few who made it to the end, and one of the few who sees what's really happening before the rest of the market catches on. This is Matrix Millionaire, and the shift is about to reveal itself.